Welcome to the Building a Successful Practice podcast channel, brought to you by the Foundation for Physician Advancement. FPA is a nonprofit built by Marney Reid and a collective of world-class surgeons to provide education and experience on the leadership development and practice management aspects of medicine. I'm Marney Reid, founding board member of FPA, and I hope you enjoy today's podcast with our incredible faculty.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We've got a great topic and best-in-class faculty to discuss how to begin building a consulting relationship with industry and considerations for protecting your intellectual property. Sharing her expertise on consulting contracts, we're joined by Emily Ast Esq of Ast Physician Contracts. We have Dr. Elizabeth Lieberman, hip and knee surgeon at Orthopedic Fracture and Specialists in Portland, Oregon, who holds many leadership roles in various orthopedic societies. Our rising star in the spine surgery community, Dr. AJ Rush at Texas Spine Consultants in Dallas, Texas. And last but absolutely never least, Dr. Nana Sarpong, hip and knee surgeon at Columbia Medical Center in New York, New York. Hey, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me, Marnie. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me. AJ Rush here. And Marnie, thanks again for inviting me.
Thanks, Marnie. Looking forward to another great podcast with you. Appreciate your time and for having us tonight.
Always great to sit down with these thought leaders. So, Lizzie, let's start with you. You began in academics and transitioned into a large private practice. Can you share why and when you decided it was the right time for you specifically to begin consulting with industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't do any consulting until I had taken and passed my boards. To be honest, there weren't a ton of opportunities or offers prior to that, but I really didn't want to have any distractions or potential conflicts before I sat for my oral boards. So for my first 2 years of practice, I did a couple of volunteer things, including webinars or research presentations, and mostly attended educational courses just to get exposure and network a little bit, but no formal consulting. And then after boards, it happened to just be a convenient time for me where I was transitioning practices, so slowing down one practice. And as I built up my other practice, I had a little bit of time, which is when I started putting feelers out and talking to some of the reps that I work with or industry relations that I met about my interest in consulting work.
I love that. Did either of the two of you, Nana or AJ, did either of you wait until you passed part 2 as well, or did you get a leg up before then?
I definitely waited a little bit in the boards period, but I certainly was, having conversations about things that interest me and about, different opportunities that arose. I was definitely open to those conversations, but, certainly wasn't trying to focus on that kind of activity during board collection. I think it's really important to just build your practice and be the best that you can be, both for your patients and for your own, expertise and community.
Yeah, I totally agree. I agree with Lizzie's sentiment on, waiting for boards before developing consultant relationships. I will say I actually signed a consultant agreement before I passed my boards, and that was because of a mentor and actually one of my current partners who got me set up right when I was finishing fellowship. And it was a relationship that had been developing over time. But outside of that, I totally agree with, waiting to make sure that you're not conflicted and you're doing, things in a sort of non-biased, non-conflicted way for ABOS.
Let's continue to unpack that a little bit, Nana, because I've heard from several other early career surgeons that their first foray into consulting was a mentor that brought them in and they felt a little bit more comfortable with this. So can you talk a little bit about how you recommend to those out there to vet opportunities if they're maybe not brought in by their mentors?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think outside of, getting opportunities from mentors, I think the things that people need to think about, Marnie, are number one, does it align with your personal values? And whether that's, teaching, serving on an advisory role. And that's been sort of the two avenues that I've sort of served in consulting. And so are you able to, check off that little bug or tick that you may have? And what exactly is it? Is it for, are you doing something that you actually use, that you feel comfortable talking about, that you could see yourself associated with, that you wouldn't be embarrassed to put in your disclosure site? And then, on the advisory side, like, is this a company that you feel comfortable associating with long-term and helping to develop something and, develop long-term relationships, even if it's a very immature and infant company. I think, yeah, I mean, people should not go into it just for money and for quid pro quo. That's definitely illegal. And I'm sure we'll get into that in this podcast because, yeah, at the end of the day, you're going to have to disclose these things and you have to be comfortable disclosing it publicly. And so it's got to be able to meet your own deep core values.
That's a great point. Lizzie, you and I had several conversations because you are very diligent about making sure that you are getting in for the right reasons. Can you talk about how you would suggest to your peers out there to vet opportunities as they come along?
Yeah, I think as you go along, kind of having formalized almost process of how you engage in any opportunity, whether it's an educational opportunity. These will come with a contract. You'll have a lawyer look at a contract. It's a very small world. So, your lawyer can say, ooh, this language doesn't work, or I've worked with these people before and I have either green flag or red flags coming from them. Looking at other people who consult with that group, even if they're in your world or outside of it. Again, the community gets smaller and smaller as you go. And so you pretty much always have a mutual connection to get more information. But I think I look at everything just with sort of a standardized process. Do I believe in the company or product or opportunity? Is it in line with my mid to long-term goals? If I run it by my inner circle, that includes, my close colleagues, my partners, and potentially somebody like an external set of eyes like a lawyer. And if everybody's in agreement that that's a good opportunity, then I think it's something that's worth pursuing.
Great tips. AJ, seeing as how there's about 10,000 spine hardware and biologics companies out there that would all love to have rockstar surgeons like yourself, how do you decide where you dedicate your time?
Start with definitely your own personal interests. I think it usually starts with things and certainly companies you already know or have some type of relationship with, whether that's through your residency, fellowship, mentors, etc. But as you said, I mean, it's a very small community. I think one thing usually can beget others. I mean, the adage that one of my mentors always said was that the person that's your hardware rep in your room today might be the CEO of a new company tomorrow. That really goes to just treating everyone with respect and knowing that, you're not the most important person in the room in every room. And there's always people will become or move throughout their career. But I think it certainly starts with going with something that you care about, following a company or passion that you have. And so I would certainly say don't go with some, brand new entity that's never been heard of. Kind of do your due diligence. And usually that starts with kind of the bigger name companies and teaching engagements, et cetera. And as you kind of find your niche and find your passion and your interests, then you may find more and more boutique companies that are more aligned with those interests or more aligned with those design ideas or just future technologies, things like that. I think that's really just kind of feeds itself.
I like what you said, about the hardware rep today could be the CEO tomorrow. There was an old adage for a little while that, most of the leadership for spine hardware companies were ticked off ex-Medtronic or NuVasive executives. So not at all untrue. Has anyone on this call had a friend, a colleague, a peer have to end a relationship with industry? And what advice would you give to people out there if maybe they got into something, it seemed great, and it just either you felt like something was off or you weren't getting out of it what you wanted?
I think at the end of the day, if the relationship is not, beneficial to both parties in the sense that you're contributing as a teacher, consultant, design, expert, anything like that, nobody wants to be working with you if you're not passionate about what you're doing as well. So I think, transparency and honesty is always going to lead you in the right direction. And so if you're not happy with the situation, whether it's, the design itself or the teaching engagement or whatever it might be that you're doing with the entity, certainly being honest about that and getting out of it. I don't think there's any hurt feelings there or no hard feelings. And certainly if there's some sort of belief that it's, not the right fit or even potentially maybe to the points we're going to talk about later, that it may be on the border of something that's like too good to be true. Again, I think being transparent, honest, and upfront is always going to be the right thing. And again, there's no hard feelings. If you don't feel comfortable as the surgeon or vice versa, if the company doesn't feel good with you, that's never going to be a good fit and certainly should be exited.
I guess, Marney, all I would say about that, I think that typically happens naturally for consultants. If you're in an agreement that's sort of not working out, these contracts are usually have time associations with it. And so If whether it's a you thing or the company's thing, it naturally will end. It hasn't happened to me, but I've heard, usually it'll happen where the contract, for example, wouldn't be renewed. But I think it happens organically. I don't think it's as artificial as one would imagine.
That's a really good point to make. You actually want to make sure that you do have an end to any contract that you end up signing. Otherwise, you could be signing over your intellectual property for the rest of your entire life. But I agree, there can be various reasons I think that a relationship would end. It's not working out for you. It's not working out for them. You have a different opportunity that's going to be a conflict, and you need to terminate something in order to pursue something else. And so I think thinking about yourself in a situation, if you need to make a change, but feelings can get involved when you develop relationships with the people that you're working with. I mean, that's one of the things I love about doing some of this consulting work. And just remember that whatever feelings you're having, the person on the other end may be having if they were in a similar situation. So I think you want to treat the relationship as important as the actual consulting opportunity, because you never know where the next opportunity or relationship may be.
Well, I agree. And, it's funny, you all get together at meetings and you talk about, cases, and you talk about, care pathways and what, cool new technology you may be using or whatnot. Industry also, talks about who's fun to work with, who's a pain in the butt, quite frankly. So I think that's a great call out right there, Lizzie, is, just remember that feelings do get involved in these relationships. So Lizzie, what's the best part about consulting, and what's something, if anything, that surprised you and you didn't know would come from consulting?
The best part is really getting to interact with engineers, design teams, and other surgeons across the country. You get in a room with people who are working on a project, and it just opens doors to your network. It's also really challenged me to think critically and in different ways about how and why I do things, and has kind of opened my eyes that there's multiple ways of doing something and we can always be doing better. I think when you get into some of these really innovative teams, that's just the energy that you're working with. And so I get to bring that back to my practice, which is why I really love working with industry, consulting, going to educational courses that, are or are not industry sponsored. And I think one thing that's been sort of surprising is as you go through training, you're sort of taught that there's a toolbox, and you walk into an operating room and you have the tools in your toolbox to use and you do a surgery. But when you meet with engineers, you realize that the options for what you can put into that toolbox are really endless. And so, again, it just makes me so much more open-minded about how I approach everything from surgery to clinic.
Building a network, I know that all of you have mentioned that that's one of the greatest things. What are you looking for when you're out there and you're meeting different people and stuff? Are you looking to kind of round out things that you might not normally think of? Are you looking to just delve in a little bit more to the engineering aspect? How do you approach networking in this?
Yeah, totally. I think it's a good question. I think networking, being made possible by industry and consultant relationships, actually, it's a really nice thing for surgeons from a couple of lenses. But number one, continued education. And so, for example, Lizzie and I, 2 Augusts or 3 Augusts ago, we sat on a panel together made possible by industry, and we were both key opinion leaders. And usually they pick different flavors of surgeons. And so, Lizzie, for example, was in private practice. I'm an academic surgeon. There are a couple of academic surgeons in private practice, and I get to learn from, other types of orthopedic surgeons. And so it's sort of a nice way to learn from different surgeons who practice in different settings and areas that you typically don't think the way that they think, number one. Number two, it allows you to, the relationships that start there allows you to foster further relationships and that may, develop your career and your professional status. And so, for example, from connections that I've made, through consulting, I've been invited to committees both on AUKUS as well as, AOS and EOA. And it certainly opened doors for me. It's also given me the opportunity to work with engineers like you're asking, right? And to really understand implants and technologies in a way that most surgeons don't think about. And it allows me to, be a better surgeon and, help my patients better. So it's a multi-pronged benefit.
I love that. AJ, You have two beautiful boys at home. Your wife is a busy physician. How do you balance it all? Because at a certain stage in your career, and especially once people start working with you and word gets out that you're enjoyable and, you start getting more and more popular with industry, how do you weigh what you say yes to and what you say, you know what, I'm going to turn this over to another person or whatnot?
Yeah, that's super tough. I think, all of us come out of training, everyone is used to drinking from the fire hose, and you essentially say no to nothing when it comes to like research opportunities and opportunities to operate more, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think we're used to being kind of yes people. I don't know, in the beginning, maybe you just don't sleep and you kind of try to do it all. But I think, you have to be cognizant of your time and, honest to yourself and your family and your practice and everything that you do. So, I think you want to be sure that you're a good contributor to whatever project or whatever teaching engagement you're on. And I think it's really just about being honest and making sure you're not overextending yourself so that you're not being the contributor that you should be, right? And I think it's maybe a live and learn type thing, right? I mean, you kind of probably toe the line at some point, maybe a couple of late nights, a couple of teaching trips or things like that then you have to turn around and go to clinic or something like that the next day. But I think, it's probably one of those live and learn sort of situations. And then you realize, like, number one, saying no to some opportunity does not mean you won't be invited back. I think people are respectful of the idea that if you don't think you're going to be able to contribute the appropriate amount of time and intellectual energy, that's not going to be a good fit. And I think once you get over that idea that it's not like saying no to your mentor for a research paper, but it's truly just, being honest with your own time, that's an easy hurdle to jump over.
Yeah, that's a great point, AJ. I've heard from, mentors that, because, oftentimes these industry events and design meetings, occur, and it's a big time consumer. Mentors have told me that they make trips out of it where, they bring their families and, outside of the opportunity and the meeting and the design event, they're able to spend time with their family, but you have to make sure it's on your dime.
Anything any of you wish that you had known before you started the journey and definitely want others to know?
Probably my biggest advice is just to be patient. And as the others have said, if you say no to an opportunity, it doesn't mean that something else isn't going to come up. And in fact, it's good to be really picky and choosy about what you do, because you're not going to be the best consultant right out of the gate. This is something that you don't want to expect you're an all-star. It's something most of us have never done before. And so slowly getting into this type of thing, asking for feedback as you go, really figuring out what aligns with your goals, because a lot of these consulting opportunities, while there may be a reward, it's going to require a sacrifice from something else. So, this is something that you have to want to do. You have to practice doing it and get good at it before, you get some of the bigger opportunities, and just be patient along the way, because if you like it and it's something you want to do, you have your whole career to work in this space.
Yeah, I love that, Lizzie. And I would add, one thing that, I think about now that I didn't think about in the past was, I sit on advisory boards now for sort of smaller early stage companies. And I'll oftentimes get asked questions on, how do you like to do things? And like, how do you think about it? And I have to stop and think about how I'm going to respond, because they will take what I say and extrapolate that to every surgeon. Obviously, an academic surgeon, it's not a private practice surgeon, it's not a private-demic surgeon. And so I have to make sure that what I believe and what I say, it's not being taken as gospel. And I have to really think before I speak, because sometimes they'll take my suggestions and, they will implement it. And so now I try to, if I feel strongly about something, I think about it from the perspective of, surgeons overall, and not just an academic surgeon that's exposed to all these resources, for example.
I think of a lot of things, what do they say? There's like the 3 A's of success, right? Like availability, affability, and just ability in general. But I think to your point, it's also, applicability matters in this space. As you said, right? I mean, if you're doing it just the way that a academic surgeon or just the way a private practice surgeon or just the way you're doing it, that's extremely, I think, narrow, and certainly won't lead to much success if it's just your way or the highway. I think the applicability to kind of universal improvement in orthopedics, spine, whatever, I think it is an important perspective to have. But I definitely think, talking about advice or things that you would want to know, I think it's just going back to realizing that the world is very small, that somebody who's a design engineer at one company very well could be a design engineer across the street at another in the future. And therefore being, again, affable to those that you interact with is super important, because, everybody could be somewhere else later on. And certainly if you ruffle feathers and make people upset, or you just rub people the wrong way because of your, general demeanor or whatever, I think that can certainly hurt you in the future. But to what Lizzie said, I think being patient and realizing that you don't have to jump on every single opportunity, saying no is completely reasonable, is certainly the right way to go, because I think honesty and integrity go a long way for these things and lead to long, fruitful relationships with all parties involved.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about how to say no to things. And I think a really great way to say no to an opportunity that may not be right for you is to say, unfortunately, I can't help with this, but here's somebody else who might be interested. If you're in a position where you're getting invitations, then you've just built a lot of credit with the company that's trying to work with you, and potentially the person that you recommended and given a new opportunity to. So there's lots of ways that things, can help build you and build your practice, your brand, everything, without you having to participate in 100% of things that come your way.
Yeah, I love that, Lizzie. And I'll add to that. And it gives you an opportunity to pass it forward and, pay it forward rather. Right. And so I've been given opportunities from mentors who, didn't have time to participate in projects or advisory panels and boards, and they recommended me. And so now, for example, if I'm busy, it's not like I'm saying no because I want to be rude or I think I'm above it, but it allows me to pay it forward to, people that I'm mentoring now in the mentorship role, my fellows, my residents who are now going to become, junior attendings.
Before we get to some really interesting contractual tips from Emily, having sat at a very large surgical device company, having sat at a very large physician services company, and bringing on healthcare professionals, which is what we call you, it's the term is HCP when we do an HCP engagement. Here are some things that I want to be very clear about that you should know about if you're building and starting your consulting. One is AdvaMed compliance. If you don't know what it is, ask your peers who do things the right way. Ask, someone within industry, tell me a little bit more about AdvaMed. Some high notes are, if you are going to dinner to talk about the opportunity of consulting or are in a consulting dinner, you cannot bring your significant other unless they are an active part of the practice and have a reason to be there. In other words, if they are your scrub tech, your circulating nurse, if they work in the OR in any capacity, if they are another surgeon and it's applicable to their practice, you cannot bring them. There are some companies that allow you to bring them, but you must pay. Then there are some companies where it's best if they just don't come at all. Do not ever, ever, ever say or write or email or text something along the lines of, well, I use a lot of your stuff, so you need to do this, or I won't use your stuff if you don't do this. You will literally be put on a freeze. And I believe AdvaMed compliance is as such that anywhere from 6 months to 18 months, you cannot be worked with whatsoever if anything like that comes along. Texts are discoverable in a court of law. So if you text something thinking you're in the clear, you could not be. Also, if you don't have a mentor like the three of these have who are getting you involved, start with your reps in the OR. Let them know that you'd love to participate if there's a teaching opportunity, but just understand their job is to suggest to marketing or medical education that you could be a great candidate. They can broker an introduction, but the second that introduction happens, they must step out. So if you have a meeting with MedEd or marketing flies in, or someone from, a VP of sales flies in and talks to you a little bit more, you can ask them if things are moving along and they can maybe give you an update, but they can't tell you anything about a contract, anything about what the hourly rate or any payment would be. So don't put them in that position because legally they have to step out from there. But amazing conversation with the three of you folks. And we're now going right over to Emily to talk about how to protect your intellectual property and a little bit more about the contractual items that these three started off with. Emily, you've reviewed tons of contracts for surgeons in various different stages of their consulting journey. So when someone is actually just beginning the relationship, it's maybe the first time they've ever worked with this company, it can be a delicate start to that relationship, and hopefully, it builds and it lasts for decades. What advice can you give those surgeons who are just beginning that relationship to make sure that they're doing the right thing to build it, but also taking care of themselves early on?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Marnie. So at the start of consulting relationships, of course, the surgeons want to provide value and establish a great relationship for the future. It's really important. What I do recommend prior to starting a consulting arrangement is to ensure, though, that the contract matches the scope of the services. And what I mean by that is if the surgeon is being asked to do a one-time teaching or a one-time lecture, we don't really want to at that point sign a 2-year all-encompassing agreement because it's just not the appropriate level that matches the services being provided. And so it's important when we think about things like non-competes and intellectual property, particularly, that scope of the services match the agreement. And I'll give an example. If a surgeon is presented with a general consulting agreement, which is usually where is the right place to start, right? Absolutely. A surgeon is going to be providing maybe teaching, maybe doing a lab to give some product feedback, those sorts of things. And that's really a great way to get started with industry. In those types of contracts, those are usually for an hourly rate type of arrangement. And sometimes surgeons get very excited when they are offered that sort of opportunity and they want to obviously be a great industry partner. And it can be very tempting to sign a very broad sweeping general consulting contract that maybe goes for 2 years, something like that, and usually includes ownership of intellectual property and a non-compete from providing similar services for another company. And what I say, you really want to match the scope. The issue I see there with that is that when these contracts have really broad language, it can actually be a hindrance to a surgeon feeling comfortable to provide ideas if they feel like everything under the sun is going to be owned by the company. And so from both sides, you really want to make that match up with the actual services being provided. So if there's a lab being done on a particular product, then the agreement can either cover that one particular lab, or what you can do is if it is a big general consulting agreement, which companies maybe want to do to provide flexibility to add more services as you go, what you can do is you can incorporate a schedule or a work order, which many companies do, and you incorporate that into the agreement. And those are usually before an event. Hey, could you do a lab on this particular knee implant part? That is on a work order or a schedule of work or something like that. And you can actually cross-reference that in the agreement that, the intellectual property, for example, that comes out of, the things that are in those work orders, that is what is going to be owned by the company. And so that way, everybody knows and everybody is in sync with what ideas are going to be discussed and what ideas are going to be owned by the company that come out of those services, versus if that same surgeon wants to work on something unrelated on their own time, that would not be covered under the agreement. So that can really make all parties feel very comfortable with these first agreements. The second part of it is usually the non-compete. And I get a lot of questions on the non-competes. It is appropriate for a contract to have a non-compete so long as it is limited, again, in the scope of the services. So if someone is doing a general consulting for a lab or a lecture on a particular product, a particular knee implant part, it would be reasonable to ask that person not to do the same exact thing for another company. But it's not appropriate to have a non-compete that covers, all consulting in the hip and knee space. That would be out of scope with the services that are being provided and would really box someone out from doing really anything else. And at the beginning of these consulting relationships, that is not an appropriate point to expect that level of exclusivity. And so again, it makes sense to incorporate these work orders or these statements of work, as I mentioned, into the agreement to actually define the scope of the non-compete. So again, it can kind of increase over time as someone does more and more with a company. You start with one lab on a knee implant, but then you're doing another one on a hip part. And those particular elements that are in the work orders, they then fall under the non-compete where you're not going to do the same exact thing for another company. So I'd say that's really the best way to protect all parties and make everyone feel comfortable moving forward with some of these first general consulting agreements.
So let me ask you this, because I have to assume, having myself worked for a couple of very large organizations where just for economies of scale, there's kind of a boilerplate template, for consulting. Do you get much pushback when a surgeon is starting off and maybe they're being asked to do just a single lab or teaching the sales team? I know that was big when I worked for MedTech, was we'd have great surgeons come in, especially the new training classes coming in. They'd always do labs. It's friendly surgeons where you can sit down and ask all the quote unquote stupid questions you'd be too scared to ask, the surgeons that you're about to work with and have to stand in the OR with on a day-to-day basis. Do you get much pushback on the non-competes?
So if someone is doing truly a one-time event, you actually can do an agreement just for that event. And so after that event is over or concluded, that agreement is no longer in place. So that is actually a great way to do these sorts of one-off events, maybe as someone's starting a relationship, so that during the time and leading, and of the time of that event, of course, they won't do the same thing, for another company. But after that is concluded, that restriction is no longer in place. So that would be one way. I do get general pushback at times. However, I really think I work with some really great teams and great attorney and business and product teams at many companies. And people really understand at this point that non-competes can feel scary to people, and that it's really important to both protect the company and the company's interest, but not in a way that's going to make people not even want to sign with you because it's just, they're never going to be able to do anything with other companies. So I've had actually very good success working with companies closely to come up with a very tailored non-compete that, again, lists maybe particular products, right? We're doing a lab and it's going to be on this particular product set, and the non-compete is limited to things that are similar or compete with those exact products. Or like I said, having a more general non-compete in the agreement itself, but with a cross-reference to that the non-compete is defined by the scope of any work orders or statements of work or those sorts of documents that legally form part of the agreement.
Have you ever had to help a surgeon and partner with industry on digging them out of a scope that was way too general, and they wanted to do something with another company, but they had the wherewithal to get that contract in front of someone like you?
Yeah, sure, I have. And I've had really good success with companies being very reasonable in these kind of scenarios, because again, companies want to work with great surgeons and surgeons want to work with great companies. So it's really a great relationship in both directions. And I have had to go back to a company once or several times, but in this instance that I'm thinking of, for example, to reduce the scope of the non-compete and ask for a carve out for something else that was proposed to someone that was really not in direct conflict or not a direct competition with the first company's project that they were doing. And in those situations, we really discussed the new opportunity, not with specifics, but the type of, work that it would entail, and really compare the two. And I've even gotten into very detailed conversations about the specific technology in one instance versus this type of technology in another, and where there's overlap and where there's not. And oftentimes everyone can get comfortable with limiting the scope of an agreement in a way that allows someone to do both. Like I said, so long as there's not usually direct competition between the two products.
I love that. And that's why we call them industry partners, not industry adversaries. Is there anything else that you'd love to share with our listeners out there?
Yeah. Think and make sure that you're always thinking of the long-term relationship, because it really is truly a long-term beneficial relationship. And it's really important to keep that in mind. If this one particular contract doesn't work out because someone is, the surgeon is doing something else for another company that's too similar, then you never know in the future, there may be something else that's slightly outside that scope that would be okay, and that the company and the surgeon could work together. So I would say approach everyone with, honesty and, of course, respect, and think of the long-term relationship and on both sides to understand that everyone can come to a reasonable agreement in most cases. And if it's just not right at this time, you never know in the future. So always leave that door open.
Well, thank you to the entire panel. This has been absolutely incredible. I'm sure all of our listeners have got many pearls, and Thanks for your time.
Thanks for listening to this podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Physician Advancement. You can find more great content on our YouTube channel at Building a Successful Practice.